this computer. And CC. Enable audio transcription. Okay, so that should start now. It should. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. So I can see the closed circuit.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Good. All right. Here we go.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and turn this around so it faces the audience, and
Yeah.
hopefully that might make the sound better. If you're having trouble with the sound, you know, if you can come a bit closer, and I've got the captions up there as well.
Yeah. Okay. So good morning, Scott. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine, Neil.
Good.
How's it been going?
You're part of our Scottish section that we've got
Right.
average for the latter part of the morning.
For the first time a Scottish section.
So
First and last, probably.
we're running about 10 minutes late. But again, further to our email, if you could try and confine your main presentation to 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll be leaving 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end.
No problem.
All right. Okay. Here you go.
Okay, so ready to go.
Yeah, we're ready to go.
Okay.
Recording?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Neil, Tony, and good morning, everyone. Yep, name is Scott Reid. I've been a member of DP UK for a few years, well, more than a few years. And I'm really sorry, I really would have wanted to have been at the conference in person. Primary reason that I'm not there in person is because I'm planning a visit back to Dallas and Fort Worth next month. So really needed to try and save some pennies and pounds for that. I'm really pleased to be doing this presentation. As it's a DP UK conference, I thought I would focus on someone from the UK and whose story may not be that widely known. So as you can see there, hopefully, on the screen, the presentation is called The Strange Case of William Duff, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And Duff was a fellow Scotsman, and we know that he worked for General Walker for a few months in late 1962 and early 1963. And that he was an early prime suspect in the Walker assassination attempt on the 10th of April 63, a crime that was eventually pinned on a conveniently dead Lee Oswald. At least one witness said that they saw Duff and Oswald together around April 63, and that Duff also alleged an association between General Walker and Jack Ruby and said he was a witness to this. Duff was investigated by the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Dallas Police. So Penn Jones once said that anyone planning to research the Kennedy assassination should take one aspect of it and research the hell out of it. So I'd like to, I maybe not researched the hell out of it yet, but I'd like to think this is my particular aspect. So just moving on, I've got about 30 slides, so I will promise Neil can keep it to about 45 minutes. A background about William Duff. He was born on November 4th, 1931, and he was the youngest of 6 children to Robert Duff and Annie McEwen. William had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. He was born in the town of Grangemouth, which is a population of around 20,000. It's located in the central belt of Scotland and is sandwiched between Glasgow and Edinburgh. You can see it pointed out there on the map, just to the west of Edinburgh. Grangemouth is the largest port in Scotland, and it also hosts one of Europe's largest oil refineries. And William's father worked on those docks, which is not surprising, as that was a key industry and employer in the town at the time. And it was a traditional working class upbringing for him. It's not much at the moment is confirmed about his early life. A British passport that was seen by a future wife of his in Dallas stated that he had worked as an engine driver for British Railways. And he also told the FBI that he had served in the British Army from around 1949 to 1952, and more specifically with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. His father sadly died of cancer on the 20th of September 1955, and some family members had moved to the USA, and he decided that he was going to make that move as well, and decided to join them. His sister had already made the move some years earlier, I think. So he made the journey across the Atlantic with his mother on the Britannic. That was a ship that was built at the same Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast that made the Titanic. But there was no such disasters for William and his mother, and they both safely arrived in New York on May the 11th, 1957. And you can see William and Annie, who's his mother, names on the Britannic manifest on the left of the slide in the red box. The document on the right-hand side of the slide is his US Declaration of Intention, and that's dated the 5th of December, 1957. He had moved to California, specifically Monterey Park, shortly after arriving in America to be close to his family, as I've mentioned. And the next chapter in his life was about to begin. So the day after the Declaration of Intention was signed, Duff actually enlisted in the US Air Force, and his service was relatively short but eventful. He was court-martialed in September 1959 for an offence that resulted in 30 days of hard labour and a $60 fine. And there were other misdemeanours committed by Duff during his time in the Air Force. These included operating a motor vehicle without a permit and drinking whiskey while on duty. And all of this really led to Duff receiving an undesirable discharge on the 18th of December 1959. There are also reports I've seen that he attempted suicide in June 1960, but the details are unknown. And records show that he also married a lady called Judy Lull on August the 5th, 1960. And it's likely that they had a daughter called Alice, and she was born in April 1961. Duff was also allegedly arrested for drunk driving in December 1960 and for indecent exposure in 1961, but the charges for the latter were subsequently dropped. So it sounds like he was leading quite a troubled existence at this point. If we fast forward to around October 1962, and Duff is now travelling down the west coast of America on a Greyhound bus, and he's headed for Los Angeles. Also on the bus is a young lady called Frances Bernard, and she said that Duff boarded the bus in Seattle and she got on in Vancouver. This is an important meeting as it actually leads to Duff eventually heading to Dallas. Now, Duff turned on the charm by all accounts and told her that he'd been at a convention of Boeing engineers in Seattle, and they must have spent many happy hours chatting during the bus trip. At the end of the trip, Frances carried on to Dallas, and William quickly followed her there, probably arriving in late October, early November 62. And within a matter of days, they actually became newlyweds, and they married on the 5th of November, 1962. Now, fireworks followed almost immediately, and the marriage didn't last. She became very suspicious of Duff and found out about the fact that he told a lot of lies. For example, he told her he was waiting on a large paycheck from Boeing, which wasn't true, and he even borrowed $800 from her to buy a car. So the marriage was annulled after only 1 month, and Frances kicked Duff out of the house without any of his belongings. Excuse me, we can see the marriage certificate there, confirming the marriage of William McHugh and Duff, Miss Frances Margaret Bernard, in the county of Dallas on the 5th of November 1962. But for Duff, the drama was really just about to start. On this slide, you will probably recognise on the left General Edwin Walker in full military uniform, and on the right is his big house in the wealthy Turtle Creek neighbourhood of Dallas, or as the local media called it at the time, Fortress on Turtle Creek. Walker also used the house as a kind of HQ and his political base in Dallas. You may notice on the front lawn are the American flags that are turned upside down. And that was really done to convey a sign of danger or distress, and was Walker's way of signalling that he thought the country was in danger because of the way it was being governed. He was fervently anti-communist and no friend of the Kennedy administration, and the enmity was mutual. In April 1961, Walker was in charge of the 24th Infantry Division in Germany, but JFK relieved him of this position because he was promoting the extreme right-wing John Birch Society and politically indoctrinating the soldiers under his command, which was violating the Hatch Act. But Walker was angry and humiliated by this. He resigned from the military later in '61 and basically made it his mission thereafter to destroy the Kennedy presidency as a civilian. He became one of the America's highest profile JFK haters and right-wing political figures, and he had lofty aspirations of becoming president himself, and actually ran a failed attempt for Texas governor in 1962, losing to John Connolly. Now, Duff's story continues when he passed Walker's house one day in late November, early December '62, and knocked on the front door that we can see in the slide. He was looking for work, and he said this was an impulsive move. Duff had told authorities in 1964 that he had no prior knowledge of Walker before arriving in Dallas, but had since read about him in the newspapers, so was aware of his work and politics. This was also not long after the Ole Miss riots that Walker had stoked up. Walker came to the door, and Duff used his powers of persuasion to get a job as Walker's what they called a batman, which was a term used in the British Army for a soldier who was assigned to a commissioned officer and really acted as his personal servant. So Duff began working for General Walker. You can see here Walker made it onto the cover of Newsweek magazine in December '61. Duff's duties included basically driving Walker around, doing some cooking, other odd jobs around the house. He started the working day by putting up those US flags that we saw on the front lawn. He wasn't paid for any of the work. He was given a room in the house and provided with meals and cigarettes, etc. But relationships became strained between Duff and others who worked as volunteers in the house. They thought he was lazy, untrustworthy, and unreliable, and he thought they disrespected him and bossed him around. This all came to a head in late February 1963, when Walker was out on the road for around 6 weeks with the evangelical preacher, Billy James Hargis, on their midnight ride speaking tour. And in Walker's absence, tensions increased and Duff was kicked out of the house. This happened around March the 10th, 1963. So Duff has found himself back out on the street again. Next slide, this talks about the assassination attempt on General Walker. He'd actually arrived home from the speaking tour on April the 8th, and he found out then that Duff had actually gone. He apparently wasn't very happy about that. But on Wednesday, April the 10th, at around 9 PM, he was sitting in his ground floor, brightly lit back room, completing his tax returns. Suddenly there was a rifle shot, and a bullet flew into the room, missing the general by inches. It had deflected off the wooden window frame, probably saving his life. Walker's arm was injured by the bullet casing, but he was not otherwise seriously hurt. You can see the damaged window frame on the slide there. Walker told the police that when he realised it was a rifle shot, he raced upstairs to grab his pistol. As he was coming back downstairs, he looked out a side window and he saw a car make a turn from the alley behind his house and onto Turtle Creek Boulevard. And the shot had come from that alley, a distance of less than 50 yards. It makes you wonder how the shooter could actually have missed. When the police arrived, Walker was not really able to give them the names of any immediate suspects. And the newspaper clipping there is actually taken from April the 11th. Walker there with a cup of tea. He looked surprisingly happy for someone He had almost been shot in the head 24 hours earlier. Now, there were no actual eyewitnesses to the attempt on Walker's life. The best witness we have was a 14-year-old at the time, and his name was Walter Kirk Coleman, and he stayed close to the Walker house. He was first interviewed by the police the day after the shooting, and he said that he was in his back room, and when he heard a noise, initially thinking it was maybe a car blowout, but he quickly realised it wasn't, ran outside and climbed the back fence. Investigating authorities would later determine that this would only have taken Coleman a few seconds. Coleman then says that he saw two men jumping into separate cars in the Mormon church parking lot, which was just north of Walker's house. One of the men then left in a light green or blue coloured Ford, and the other man left in a dark coloured car that Coleman was unsure of the make at the time, but later said it was a 1958 Chevrolet. In the Chevrolet, he said that he saw a man bending back over the front seat as if the man was putting something in the back of the car. And just speculation on my part, but could this man have been placing a rifle in the back of the car? That's a picture of Coleman taken from a PBS documentary that we've probably all seen, called Who Was Lee Harvey Oswald? But this slide here is just to give you a little bit of a context as to the area that we've just been talking about. You can see Walker's house in the middle there, identified under 4011 Turtle Creek Boulevard. And we've got Turtle Creek Boulevard itself running down to the east of the house. To the west, where the red star is, that would be the approximate location of the shooter, and obviously the red arrow being the path of the bullet. The yellow kind of gold square is really the area where Coleman's house would have been located, and the red square is where the church parking lot would have been. The church would have just been further north. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea and an overview of area in question. So Duff, by the time of the shooting attempt, Duff had been gone from the house for around a month, but within days he actually became a prime suspect. And this was mainly based on information that was given to the police by two senior aides to General Walker. They were his secretary, Julie Knecht, and a friend and business associate called Robert Surrey. On April the 12th, 2 days after the shooting, Surrey gave police Duff's name and provided them with some background about him and his activities in the house. And understand it was actually Surrey who packed Duff's suitcase when he left the house. Surrey also recommended that the police also speak to Julia Knecht. She was interviewed the same day, and she said that after about a month, Duff had actually been offered other jobs, but he chose to stay and work with General Walker. She also felt the police should interview a lady called Miss Wandale Whitley, and she had recently been engaged to Duff, but it had been broken off when she found out he had been borrowing money from her mother. The police did interview Miss Whitley, and she added that the engagement had been broken off 3 weeks earlier. She had last seen Duff on April the 6th. She didn't know where he was currently staying, but she did have a phone number which would hopefully help the police track him down. So all of that really led to William Duff's arrest. To my knowledge, he is the only person who was ever arrested in connection with this case, and he was arrested on April the 18th, 1963. We've got his mugshot there on the slide. It's still the only picture I've ever been able to source of William Duff. I'm still looking, so hopefully I'll find more. At the time, he was living in an apartment at 4919 San Jacinto in Dallas, which was only a few miles from Walker's house. He was fingerprinted and placed in jail. The police didn't really have any evidence to detain him for any length of time, but interestingly, the actual arrest charge was recorded as swindle. But I feel as if the police were looking for any reason to pick him up, after what Surrey and Connect had said, and I'm sure they had the Walker shooting on their minds when they picked them up. On this slide on the left is the apartment that he would have been living in living in at the time. I took that picture a few years ago in Dallas. Duff would have been on the second floor. And on the right is the arrest report, which confirms that the charge was swindle. The handwriting further down the arrest report is quite difficult to make out, but it says, subject is an immigrant from Scotland. He has lived in Dallas since October 1962. He has not worked since coming to the city, has been bumming off so-called friends, obtaining money under false pretenses, please mug. So it's perhaps a slightly unkind description of Duff, but it's really how the police and a lot of people in Dallas saw him at the time. So just moving on to Robert Surrey again. Now, you may be aware that he was the man that was primarily responsible for the infamous Wanted for Treason leaflet that was distributed around Dallas at the time of the JFK assassination. He was in the publishing business, and he'd set up a company with Walker called the American Eagle Publishing Company. They basically promoted Walker's activities and published his speeches, etc. Surrey was interviewed by police on the night of the Walker shooting, and he told a story about seeing two men acting suspiciously around the Walker house at 9 p.m. a few days earlier. He said he drove up behind the alley and observed two white males sitting at the rear of the car in a dark-coloured 1963 Ford. The two men got out of the car, went up to the Walker house as if they were basically casing it. When the men got back to the car and drove off, Surrey followed them, but he soon lost them downtown and noticed that the car didn't have a license plate. Surrey was interviewed by the Warren Commission in June 1964. He basically told them the same incident, and that it took place on Monday, April the 8th, 2 days before the actual shooting attempt. That was actually the same day that Walker returned from his speaking tour, and Surrey basically said that the two men had been lurking around the house, peeking in windows and so forth, that he'd never seen the two men before. Now, whoever these two men were, and if the incident Surrey described actually took place, it would not be unreasonable to speculate that they could have been the two men that Kurt Coleman saw on the night of the Walker shooting on the 10th of April. An interesting addition to Surrey's story is told in Gail Nix Jackson's excellent book called Pieces of the Puzzle. Gail saw a 2012 interview with Robert Surrey's eldest son, David, in which he says that the whole Surrey family were at Walker's house when the shot was fired. David and his father then went out looking for the shooter, and after a while, his father pulled up behind a car. Robert Surrey got out and actually spoke to a man. Surrey asked the man, quote, "Did you get him?" And the man answered that he missed. Now, we don't know who this man is, and if David Surrey's recollection is correct, it means we may have to reflect again on what Robert Surrey told the police and what really happened at Walker's that night. And I would recommend Gail's book for anybody who wants to know more about that incident. It's an excellent book. So the story of William Duff now takes an even more intriguing turn. In the Julia Connect papers, they're held at the 6th floor museum in Dealey Plaza. And I had the opportunity a few years ago of looking at some documents in those files. They include notes written by Connect about a telephone call that was made to Walker's house around noon on May the 28th, 1963, by a woman who wouldn't identify herself, but who had an urgent personal message for Walker. Walker was not available to take the call, but the woman was persuaded to continue with her message, and Julia Connect was alerted and listened into the call. The lady had told a story after getting tanked up on scotch. William Duff had been bragging that he was the man who had fired the shot at the general. He said in the first place that he was a communist and he'd been picked to do the job to start an interracial riot and get the NAACP involved. Duff said that he had an alibi for the night in question, but it wasn't true. He'd actually told Walker after the shooting incident that he was in Phoenix, Arizona at the time and was working for the Denver-Chicago truck lines. That firm was unknown to the trucking industry in Dallas, and the Dallas police were unable to trace the company. The caller went on to say that Duff had then disappeared for about an hour, and when he came back, he was, quote, white as a sheet and scared to death. He said the communists had paid him, and he was in a lot of trouble with them as he had failed to kill Walker. Whilst the call to the Walkers was made on May the 28th, it's not clear from the notes when Duff is supposed to have made these comments, but Julia Connect took the call seriously enough that she contacted General Clyde Watts, who at the time was Walker's friend and legal counsel. Watts was part of a law firm based in Oklahoma City. Watts had told Connect that she would send down a private investigator called Cliff Roberts to check in with her. Roberts was a partner in the K&R investigation service in Oklahoma City with his partner Bill Keister. He had done some private investigative work for Clyde Watts and his legal firm in the past, and were both former law enforcement officers in Oklahoma City. So a private investigation of William Duff actually begins. I know there's quite a lot on this slide as a timeline, so I'll try and quickly move through it from left to right. 28th of May was when the call was made to the Walker House, and the K&R investigation service received their assignment. So Cliff Roberts, he spoke to Julia Connect, and he made his way down to Dallas, and she provided him with as much information as she could about William Duff. On May the 30th, 1963, Roberts located Duff's apartment. He was now living on Lewis Street, and he was staying there with two other men. That night, Roberts said he saw Duff coming home around midnight. The next day, the 31st of May, Roberts spoke with a local waitress who knew Duff. Hadn't seen him in about a week, but said he had been hanging about with another guy who was starting to talk with a Scottish accent. Roberts planned to rent an apartment at the Lewis Street building. On the 1st of June, Roberts then told Connect that he may have had two guys mixed up, and he now wasn't sure which one was Duff, but he had moved into the Lewis Street apartment. On the 2nd of June, Roberts attends a community party, and Duff is present. And Duff had apparently been egging people on for a fight, and one guy actually took him up on it, so much so that the police were called, but Roberts helped Duff avoid any problems with the police. Around 2 AM that evening, Duff knocked on Roberts' door. The two men had a drink and had a chat together, and Roberts basically was trying to gain Duff's confidence. Duff wanted to actually move in with Roberts and asked him if he would go to Mexico with him. The K&R report was in the Connect papers, and in that report it says that Cliff Roberts got to talking with Duff about General Walker. Roberts felt that Duff knew some pertinent facts about the shooting, but he never admitted to him that he was responsible. He did state, though, that a general dislike for Walker, and said that he knew there was money to be made by assassinating him, and if he could make contact with the money, then he would do it. He laid out a plan, and Roberts told Duff that he knew someone with the kind of money, and he could make the necessary arrangements. Roberts then discussed what he had found out with General Walker and Clyde Watts. Bill Keister then arrives in Dallas on June the 3rd, posing as the money man, and the two men met with Duff. And on June the 4th, the investigators discussed the assassination of Walker with Duff and agreed to pay him $5,000 to carry it out. It was, of course, a fake offer. The three men then drove to Turtle Creek, which was where Walker's house was. On this slide, we can see that it was a journey of just over 2 miles from the apartment on Lewis Street to Walker's house. It took less than 10 minutes by car. You can also see basically the location of Turtle Creek Boulevard in the wider Dallas area, with Dealey Plaza further to the south, a couple of miles. So the men drove there on the 4th of June, and it was effectively a reconnaissance mission. And the plan was for the assassination of General Walker to take place on Monday, June the 10th. As they drove around the neighbourhood, Keister and Roberts secretly recorded their conversations with Duff. House Select Committee on Assassinations obtained a 27-page transcript of those conversations. In them, Duff indicated that he had knowledge of bombs and said, quote, "I know enough about bombs to put them together. You can blow the whole front end off," presumably referring to Walker's house. And he also talked of a getaway driver, but Duff insisted that the driver got no piece of the action. Talked about hopping on a plane to the Bahamas, or Nassau as it was British territory, maybe then moving on to Hong Kong or Singapore. Duff also briefly mentioned a partner called George, which unsettled Roberts and Keister. I haven't yet been able to work out who this person was or if he even existed. And Duff also spoke about how he can put a rifle together in 2 minutes. He'd done it in the army, and then after shooting Walker, he would dump the murder weapon in the creek nearby. He also spoke about paying Walker a social call and shooting him at close range with a silencer. So all of that resulted in the tape and other documents being handed over to the police. And on June the 7th, 1963, Roberts and Keister met with the police, but unbeknown to them, Duff had got his retaliation in first. He had already spoken to Agent Hosty, a name we know well, of the Dallas FBI office, and he reported what had taken place. Perhaps Duff even thought Roberts and Keister were serious about the plan. You can see on this slide, that is basically the invoice that Roberts and Keister sent to Walker. It came to just over $1,200, which I think is the equivalent of around $12,000 in today's money. The bill includes a midge tape cartridge, which was used to record the conversations with Duff. And I thought it was amusing that they spent $56 on whiskey and beer, so they were able to ply Duff with drink. That's over $500 in today's money, so they didn't really hold back much on that particular expense. So following everything that had taken place that previous few weeks, the police decided to bring Duff back in for questioning. And on June the 12th, they carried out a polygraph test on him. He was asked 6 questions. Do you have a grudge with General Walker? Did you shoot at General Walker? Do you remember who you were with the night General Walker was shot at? Have you given any information to anyone about the activity of General Walker or the layout of the house, except the 2 men from Oklahoma? Have you owned or had in your possession a high-powered rifle since you have been in Dallas? And do you know who shot at General Walker? As we can see there, Duff answered no to all of the questions. It was felt that there may have been a language barrier which could have affected the outcome, but the only question that gave the police food for thought was number 3, which was asking Duff if he remembered who he was with the night Walker was shot at. Duff seemed puzzled by this question, which could have given the indication of deception, but they put it down rather to the passage of time that had elapsed between April the 10th and June the 12th, when the polygraph was carried out. As far as the police were concerned, they did not think that Duff was involved in the Walker shooting, and what's ended the private investigation. But Roberts and Keister did feel that if Duff could have got his hands on the $5,000, he would have made off with it. So Duff's not really in the clear because a man called Joe Lauria ran a restaurant called the Mr. Barbecue in Dallas, and Duff was a regular customer, and he knew him well and called him Scotty. Lauria was interviewed by the FBI in December 1963. Now, he was convinced that he had actually seen Duff in his restaurant with Oswald around 7 or 8 months earlier. That would place that meeting at around April 1963. He said he only saw them together the once. Lauria based his identification of Oswald on pictures he had seen of him in the newspapers. It said he would, quote, bet money that it was him. Now, of course, by that point, Oswald's face was probably one of the most recognisable in the world. But is it possible that William Duff was acquainted with Lee Oswald? They were certainly both in Dallas at the time. Or was Lauria simply mistaken and he saw Duff with someone who looked like Oswald? We know that there were lookalikes around the Dallas area. It was certainly enough for the FBI and the Secret Service to renew their interest in William Duff. Another witness implicates Duff and Oswald. This person is called Juanita Buchanan. She ran the El Dorado bar in Dallas with her husband, and she also knew Duff as Scotty. The bar that she ran was close to the places that Duff had lived in around April-May 1963, and Buchanan had actually previously worked for Jack Ruby at the Commerce Club under the name Juanita Sparks. She was interviewed a few times by the police and the FBI, and in June 1963, she said that she was not the anonymous caller to Walker's house, but did think that Duff was capable of shooting someone. In December 1963, and after the alleged Duff-Oswald sighting made by Joe Lauria, she told the FBI that she knew of no link between them. She did, though, associate Duff to an Andre Angeles, who reportedly flew to Dallas on the day of the JFK assassination, carrying a large sum of money. Now, according to a 2015 posting on a JFK forum website, Buchanan claimed to reporter Sue Fitch that Duff had actually come into her bar twice with Oswald, including on the night of the Walker shooting. They left together around 8 p.m. Duff came back alone later that night around 11:30, and by that time she had heard on the radio about the shooting at Walker's house. She asked Duff why he would want to shoot Walker, and apparently Duff went, quote, white as a sheet, and left. He added to Fitch that the police arrived around half an hour later looking for Duff, and that he was arrested later with Oswald. These are the basics of the story as reported to Sue Fitch, who then relayed it to another researcher, Irving Heinman. So it's passed through a few hands. It's a pretty explosive story if it's true, but there's little to corroborate it, so I treat it with extreme caution. It did make me think, though, that Buchanan could have been the anonymous caller to Walker's on May the 28th, even if she denied it. The caller and Buchanan both mentioned Duff going, quote, white as a sheet, and leaving and returning later. General Walker also believed that Oswald had been arrested on the night of the shooting and then secretly released in the early hours on Kennedy orders. But Walker was also unable to ever verify that claim with any witnesses or evidence, and Walker basically blamed the Kennedys for everything. Duff had left the Dallas area around August 1963. He first went to Oklahoma in search of work as a truck driver, but you needed your own truck, so that was a non-starter. And then after an initial unsuccessful attempt to enlist in the army, which was rejected for moral reasons, he did successfully enlist in August 1963, and he was sent to Fort Polk in Louisiana for basic training. It was whilst at Fort Polk when Duff heard about the JFK assassination. After completing his training, Duff was transferred to Fort Sill, Oklahoma in December 1963. The allegation that was made by Joe Lauria that he saw Duff with Oswald in his restaurant around April 1963 had investigating authorities back on his trail. And in January 1964, he was tracked down and he became the centre of attention again. This part of the story focuses on allegations that Duff made that he had seen Jack Ruby a few times at General Walker's house during the period when he worked there. We now have Duff being mentioned in the same breath as Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, two of the most well-known figures in the JFK assassination conspiracy. Another timeline, again, I'll try and go through this as easily as I can. This is basically about what Duff told authorities about the Ruby Walker Association. So on the 24th of January 1964, Duff was tracked down to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. He was interviewed in the Army hospital where he had just undergone surgery for a double hernia. He was told that he did not have to make a statement. Anything he did say might be used against him in a court of law. And Duff confirmed that he had worked for General Walker, but he denied any personal association with Lee Oswald or Jack Ruby. A few months now pass and Duff is interviewed again on April the 8th. His recollection of events started to change and he now started dropping hints of an association between Walker and Jack Ruby when he was at the Walker house. Duff by this point had married Peggy Marie Craig in January 1964, and both Duff and his new wife were in regular contact with Special Agent James Cantrell of the Oklahoma Secret Service. On May the 20th, 1964, Duff called Cantrell to inform him that the man who had offered him money to shoot Walker was now following him, and this was Cliff Roberts. Roberts had told Duff's wife that there were warrants out for his arrest. Duff wanted Cantrell's help in telling his wife that this wasn't true. During another call later that day, Duff had put his wife on the phone to speak to Cantrell. She asked Cantrell if he would call her the next day at her office, and Cantrell did try to do that, but he was unable to reach her. On May the 25th, 1964, Agent Cantrell then received a call from Mrs. Duff. She said that her husband had vital information concerning the assassination of President Kennedy. They arranged to meet later that evening at a police station. Duff was also present, and it's then that he began to flesh out his story of the alleged association between Walker and Ruby. During the time Duff worked and lived at Walker's, he said Ruby had visited the house about once a month with two other males. The three men and Walker went into the living room, so Duff was never privy to any of their conversations. Duff expressed fear of Walker, which was why he had not reported it before. He knew a lot about Walker's business and even said that Walker had been moving money raised for the John Birch Society to a personal bank account. After hearing this story, Cantrell took Duff aside and out of earshot of his wife told him that if this turned out not to be true, he could be prosecuted. Duff insisted it was true and would take another lie detector test. It was also at this time that he said that he would be discharged from the army shortly for fraudulent enlistment, as he had never notified them of his previous service in the Air Force. On June the 7th, 1964, Duff was in Oklahoma City and he contacted Clyde Watts and told him of his current situation and that he needed a job. He had indeed been discharged from the army on June the 2nd, and he was now also divorced from Peggy. Watts contacted a friend and found Duff both a job and temporary living accommodation. Watts said that his motivation for doing this was to keep Duff around because he still wanted to find out what he knew about the Walker assassination attempt. On June the 12th, 1964, Duff's now ex-wife, Peggy, contacted Agent Cantrell and told him that she had recently spoken with Duff on the telephone. Duff had updated Peggy on his current living arrangements, but would not provide her with his address. She thought this might be because he was to pay her $100 a month in alimony. He did though leave a contact number, and she called him later that evening. She reminded him that he had promised Cantrell that he would take a lie detector test when discharged from the army, and Duff responded by saying, quote, "You notify Cantrell and I'll be gone." On June the 16th, Cantrell caught up with Duff and interviewed him again. Duff said he observed many visitors whilst at Walker's, and when photographs of Jack Ruby appeared in the newspapers after he shot Oswald, he believed him to be one of the people that had visited Walker once a month between December 1962 and February 1963. However, during this interview with Cantrell, Duff suddenly was not so sure it was Ruby, and there was now some, quote, doubt in his mind. Duff gave various descriptions of the man he thought was Ruby, and went on to say that he had not reported it back in January 1964 because he was recovering from an operation and was more focused on his personal welfare and physical condition. He also reiterated that he had never seen Lee Oswald or was associated with Andre Angeles, as was alleged by Juanita Buchanan. Just a quick slide, that's a picture of Peggy Duff with her new husband, Henry Zavadil. She married him shortly after her divorce from Duff. So what do we make of the things that Duff said he saw whilst working at Walker's house? Did Duff actually witness a right-wing plot involving Walker and Ruby? Or was he just seeking to impress his wife due to their marital problems? Even Agent Cantrell suspected that Duff may have just been trying to impress his wife. Was he seeking some form of revenge on Walker because of the Roberts and Keister investigation? It couldn't have been a pleasant experience to find out that his former employer and friend had effectively been trying to entrap him. And Cliff Roberts had also been telling lies to his wife that there were warrants out for his arrest. Did he just like being the centre of attention and couldn't help telling lies and exaggerating his own importance? Or did he change his story because Clyde Watts had now helped him and found him a job and a place to stay? That seems on the face of it to be an eminently reasonable explanation because of his circumstances at that time. And we should note that Duff only backtracked on the Walker Ruby story once Watts had started to take care of him and found him the job and a place to stay. Who really was William McEwen Duff? As the title of the presentation suggests, he was a bit of an enigma. I suppose it's easy, complacent maybe, to just dismiss him as a con man and a liar, but I think he's worthy of more research and respect, and perhaps he was a lot smarter than we thought and had been underestimated. Was it really just an impromptu, spontaneous act when he happened to turn up on the doorstep of General Walker's in late 1962 and then spend the next 4 months or so inside the house observing Walker's business and comings and goings? Even Walker had some suspicions that volunteers in his house may have been monitoring him and that the house could have been bugged. What if Duff really did meet Lee Oswald in Joe Laurier's restaurant? Why would they have had reason to do that, and what could they have been discussing? We know that Oswald was smart and an intelligence agent. What if Duff had also had some kind of a similar cover and also was an intelligent foot soldier? What similarities and parallels are there between both men? Oswald had joined the military. Duff also joined the military. Oswald received an undesirable discharge from the Marine Corps. Duff received an undesirable discharge from the Air Force. Oswald was court-martialed. Duff was also court-martialed. Oswald attempted suicide, allegedly. Duff also attempted suicide. Oswald posed as a communist. Duff also mentioned he was a communist. When Oswald went to New Orleans in 1963, he appeared at Guy Bannister's office looking for a job. Duff also did the same when he turned up at General Walker's house in Dallas. Are these all coincidences, or was there something deeper going on? Even General Walker, when testifying to the Warren Commission, felt that Duff tricked Roberts and Keister more than he had been tricked by them. A friend of mine in the US directed me towards two posts in a JFK online forum. The first post was from April 2010, and it claimed to be from Duff's daughter. That would be Alice, the daughter from the marriage to Judy Lull in August 1960. She said she had just found out that her father had been hired by General Walker and was the person who tried to kill him, and that her father also knew Ruby Oswald and was a part of the JFK killing. The second post was 3 years later, July 2013, and was from someone claiming to be Alice's son. He said that his mother had died around 5 months ago, and that would be accurate, as Alice actually died in March 2013. So William Duff would be his grandfather. He said his grandfather had been in the CIA for a decade and requested information that could help locate his whereabouts. Is it possible Duff was in the CIA, and are these posts genuine? Just maybe there was more to Duff than meets the eye. So what became of William Duff? He kind of went off the radar in late 1964. In those Julia Connect papers that I read in Dallas, suggested that he was back in Dallas in July 1971 and had contacted General Walker again. He called Walker from a payphone at the bus station and wanted to come out and spend the night, and he was looking for money. Walker told him that he didn't accept calls so late at night and to call back at noon the following day. Walker then told Julia Connect, and the police were informed, and the house was put under special surveillance. Walker even thought that Duff might have Harvey's gun, as his house had been broken into the Sunday after Easter and the gun had been stolen. Duff did indeed call back the next day and wanted to come out and see Walker. He said he'd been working in Alaska for a construction company the past 4 years. Walker told Duff that there was no money, no job, and no place for him here. There was also reference to Duff having had a relationship with a police officer's wife, so he still had the ability to charm the ladies. And in fact, Duff may have married again in February 1968, another short relationship that ended only 4 months later. Now, William McEwen Duff died on April the 26th, 1992 in Clark County, Nevada. I contacted the Clark County Records Office in Las Vegas a few years ago to find out the cause of death. They referred me to the Southern Nevada Health District, but they were not willing to release information to me as death records are not public in Nevada, and I had no proof of entitlement to a death certificate. They did tell me that his funeral was handled by the Palm South Jones Mortuary in Las Vegas, which is just off the strip. I also reached out to them on a few occasions for information, but without success. So the next time I'm in Las Vegas, I'll probably pop in person. I also wrote to a niece of Duff's in Texas a few years ago, but she did not reply, assuming she received my letter. But my friend in the US did follow up, and she received a message from the niece in October 2020, confirming that she was indeed related to William McEwen Duff, but she didn't have any information on him and that he was estranged from her family and had been for many years. I totally understand that they wouldn't want to discuss him, and I respect that. So Duff may be dead, but there are still some leads to go on, and I'm sure his story lives on. So that's the end of this presentation. Happy to answer any questions, or if anybody's got any comments.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you, Scott. That was an excellent presentation. That was a very well organised PowerPoint, very thorough. We are overrunning, so really, if I could keep questions down to one or two, if anybody has got any questions. Yeah, Mike. Got a microphone. Yes. Just getting a microphone, Scott.
One point near the beginning, you showed a handwritten statement from the police in, I can't remember, was it in Dallas? About how Duff was burning around his friends. Actually, I think that said bumming around. You said the handwriting is difficult, but bumming around would be a pretty good interpretation of what was up. Just a minor point, but if you're changing it into text, you might want to speak out.
Did you catch that, Scott?
I caught a little bit of it, but is there any chance you could summarise it? If just
Yeah,
the
I
sound wasn't.
think Mike was saying there's a typo in one of your
No.
slides.
It's not a typo.
No?
It's a misinterpretation of the handwriting on a police document that was near the beginning of your talk about how Duff was, you said burning around, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, okay.
And it actually is bumming around.
Yeah, Mike's saying that there was a misinterpretation of the handwriting, and you stated burning around, and he believes you should have stated bumming around.
I thought I did say bumming around. That's probably the language barrier that happened in the polygraph test as well. But yeah, I did say bumming around, but it'll be my Glasgow accent.
Did you pick that up from the transcript, or did you actually?
No.
Because the transcript was horrendous.
But I did have a little trouble with charming accent.
Okay, all right. It's a non-issue, Scott. Don't worry.
Okay.
David,
I'm sure there were many spelling mistakes in the presentation as well.
The transcript. We had the transcript running because we've got an audio problem with this computer, and with your Scottish accent, you wouldn't believe the sentences that were coming out.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, Scott, talking about the language difference, one of your phrases was a $60 fine, which came up on the screen as sexy or plane.
All right,
maybe we could
maybe
we could put out a separate release of the transcription. That would be fun.
You can just speak here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Scott, can you
Hi.
hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
It's again, it's a bit like what Mike's just done. Not really a question as such, but something you can follow up. Duff claimed to be in the army between 1949 and 52. Now that seems to fit with the fact that being born in 31, he would have been 18 in around 49. Almost certainly, unless as a dock worker, he was considered to be in a reserved trade or reserved profession, he would have been in the army, quite likely under national service. He would have been conscripted, and in 49 to 52, he would have had no choice. So there's a very good likelihood that he was indeed in the army, and it may be something you can follow up and double check on. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have actually written to the Ministry of Defence because they have a big records department in Glasgow, and I have written to them requesting information on William Duff. That was about 12 months ago, and I'm still waiting. And I believe that there are massive backlogs. So, but yeah, I do intend. I would like to know more about his service.
Yeah, you might be faster just getting down to what we now call the National Archives in Kew, or even going to the Army, whichever, the Argyll and Sutherland's museum. You're probably more likely to get records there than directly through the MOD. Just a thought.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. You're
Thanks
welcome.
very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed, Scott, and hopefully I'll see you in person in November in Dallas.
Yep, we'll look forward to that. Yep, and
Okay.
thanks again. I hope the rest of the day goes well.
Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Mhm.